Welcome to Cute Widgets and More. In this episode, I will once again talk about model view, and I'll implement the second coolest name, at least in this show. Obviously, you cannot beat Depeche Model as model for Depeche Mode, but this one is called the Delegating Delegate. Before you sign off and say, I'm not going to have that many delegates that it's going to be interesting for me, please do stay on the channel. I will be talking about more or less everything I ever said about model view on this channel, because I'm going to take a lot of these ends and knit them together into something that's going to be truly beautiful. And at the end, I will even take you to codebrowser.dev and show you how I actually solved a problem working around what was a bottom heap. So buckle up, here we go. Let's start in main.cpp as always. Let's press the run button so we can see what's going on. I have an amazing user interface here. It's a queue table view and it has 3 columns. And at this time, you should already start getting I don't know what that's called in English. You should get one of those. And why? Well, look at the user interface here. Not the fact that I bought some kitten and some food and I forgot to feed my kittens for 4 days before I sold them off and made a few bucks on that. No, what should get you really worried is the date format over here. Is this May 5th or is it January 5th? Well, May 1st or January 5th? It reminds me of that good old joke. What is the perfect date? Well, obviously, it's ISO. Year, month, day. That sorts well, and everybody should be using that. And that was an outset for this whole episode that I had in my application. I had some views that would display the dates locally and like this Danish format here, and some that would show it using ISO, and it was confusing a lot of people. Let's see how I solve that problem. And what I will do here is implement a delegate that I just need to instantiate once and not need to instantiate on each and every cell, or on each and every table, at least in my application. Okay, let's walk through the code together. There will be a lot of things that I'll walk over really fast because I already talked about them in previous episodes, but I will give you links to those. And if you do not want to break me up in this presentation here, just go to the show notes below. They will be sorted in the order that I gave you them in this presentation here. So we start out with main. As always, we are creating a queue application instance. The register converter, that's actually the first link already. That is for being able to convert a money instance from my model rather than creating a queue string. So I return an instance of money from my model that goes into a queue variant, and that works perfectly well. But at some point, the view needs to display that on the screen, and it does so by calling toString. Next, let's look at the implementation of the model itself. Remember, model view, you have a model, you have a view, and if you forgot, here's another link to Programming with Qt, where hopefully when you watch this, there are a number of episodes out on model view programming. So I have a subclass of QAbstractTableModel, and it implements this API that we've seen a number of times, and underneath the model, there is some data structure. It is inside of the model here, but as I've told you many times on this channel, think about the data as sitting somewhere else. If we go up and just look at the code here, here's a copyright. I'm not going to read that for you. Here is the data, and I actually like this format here where I'm forced to have the names inside of the struct here. That's actually a new warning, I think it's called, in ClangType. And if you don't know what ClangType is, here's another link for a previous episode where I talked about ClangType. My row count, so this is just setting up the data. My row count basically go and count how many items there was in this data structure up there. That's not going to be a very realistic setup, but it's just for this example here. And you can see it says check underscore row count. One thing you need to remember when you look at models is that they might actually not be called directly from a view. They might be called from a proxy model sitting on top of it, and that one might be broken. So you better be checking your constraints when you get into your function, and I have an episode on that too. Then we have our column count, and observe the small plus there. Yet another episode. This one is converting the enum class to an integer. That is actually located. If you don't want to go to that episode, then you can see it's in the enum converters, and it's this code that sits up here. Okay, so far so good. So my column count, simply go and look at how many columns there are, and that's not what I wanted to. I want to go here. That is pretty cool, because I can just name my columns like this, and if I add another column count will always be up to date. Okay, now further down here, I can see I do an enum cast. That's because I like to go with these names when I switch, because then I'm sure that my compiler would tell me if I forgot one. Again, the episode just before also talks about enum cast. And scrolling a bit further down, what else do we have? Set data and flags. And that's a relatively simple model that we have here. Before we go and look at the delegate, let me just scroll up here and find a crucial line in here, namely return data.amount. And amount, so we can see over here, is an instance of this class money. And I do not need to wrap it. It's a let's see, data returns a Q variant. So I don't need to explicit wrap it in a Q variant. If I just, on my money class, let's just go right there. Money, on my money class, have this Q variant macro that will instantiate an implicit conversion from this class to a Q variant. Yet another episode on that. Okay, looking at the money class, there is really not much to say about this class. You will have seen it many times before. It's just a simple wrapper around a currency and an amount. So $500 or 400 euros. These are the only two currencies in this class here. And one addition that came with this one here is metatype ID. So at a bit further on in my Delegating Delegate class, I want to test whether the variant holds a money instance. And the best way to do that is to go and ask if the metatype ID is of the correct type. So metatype ID, simply Q register metatype here and do that in static. That would give me a unique number for money instances, or not instances, for the money class in the scope of a Q variant. Let's get back and look in main. A model view setup usually has three things to it. It has a view that you take one of these out of the toolbox. You might modify it a bit by specifying certain properties to it. Then you have the model, which you almost always override. And finally, you have the delegate for however you like to paint and edit yourselves. And that's the part that we're getting to now. You saw there was step 0, that was not doing anything. Step 1 is what you usually would see that you create for this column here. And again, observe the plus and the beauty of that. If the order or whatever in the column changes, or in the columns of the model changes, it will still hit the right one here. So no 0 and 1 or whatever, which I wrote very early in my model view days. And set item delegate for column, specifying the delegate here and another delegate there. And that's the usual setup. Let's see what these delegates look like. So date delegate, that is subclassing from Q widgets and more delegate. Here's a link on that where I go in and talk about the Q widgets and more delegate. But the key thing is that it has this paint internal, which allows me to paint the data here. And observe that paint internal, it is painting a Q string that is in ISO date format, which is my little pet peeve. See, now they are much nicer, and you can see that it was only 4 days I forgot to feed the cat. Okay, that's the paint internal. There is a bit of editing these things too. So I need to call create, or no, I don't. The view call create editor on the delegate whenever there is a change in that. And it will go and set the display format on this date editor here. And then whenever the editor is actually set on a widget, it will do this stuff here, which is basically taking the index and pulling the date out of the index for the edit role, and then setting that date on my editor. And finally, when I am done, when I press enter or tab or go to a new cell by clicking on it or something else, that means that the data should be taken from the editor to the model, and this is the code that's being executed there. And just in case that was a bit too fast, here's yet another link for the programming with Qt widgets, where I talk about the delegates. Let's also go over and look at the other delegate. That was the date delegate, the money delegate. That one is subclassing from Q item delegate, and Q item delegate has the same set of methods to implement. Here it returns a money editor, and let's just run it here so you can see the money editor in action here. I can choose the currency and I can choose the amount. And now I paid $20 more for, well, I changed currency too, so I can't say anything about that. But that's the idea there. That's the money editor. It's a Q widget subclass that will be created and fit into that cell where I'm editing it. And set editor data and set model data, same as before. And this code down here is just to make sure that it's fitting inside the cell. And if I one day go and say, nope, then let's see this one. Oh, it's fit in the cell. That code. I thought that code would make sure that it would be large enough, but besides the point in this episode. If you have been following this channel very closely, you might have seen the money editor before. I made a few changes to it for this episode. Let me just show you those. First of all, let me just bring it up again here. I changed the margins, or you can't see that when I point here. Think of this code over here. I changed the margins so that it fills the whole space. Before it had a margin of, 8-10 pixels or so on both sides and on top and bottom. And that actually made it quite a bit less size for the actual editor, which is very important when you have it in a tiny cell. Then I set the spacing. That's the space between these two here. So I make that small too. The set contents margin 0000000. By the way, that was an episode here. I think that was one of the very first episodes of Qt widgets and more. So forgive the quality of that episode. I also changed the minimum to be mean because I didn't like that I had minus 100 whatever here because there was only 0 as a minimum. But that's the design thing. And then here, set autofill background true. Now you need to go and find an episode of programming Qt widget if that is magic for you. But basically what it tells is that the whole background here, see when I double click here, you see no bluish color there. Let me just try and comment this out and run it, and you will see that when I bring up the editor will be transparent in those pixels that it doesn't paint, which makes it look bluish, which just to my aesthetics sense made like, oh, that's slightly ugly. And now to what this episode really is all about, namely the Delegating Delegate. Let me admit, I was not sitting in the offices in Oslo back in the early 2000-ish when Model View was implemented, but I'm sure that back then they were thinking we need a data method. That data method should be able to return, say, a display role, that's a string, a pixmap or an image, that's a qpixmap, a font, that's a qfont. And now you need to rewind back to what I said. A display role, a string, I said, because I'm sure that's what they thought back then. And then somebody would say, well, how do you edit that string then? I want a color editor, or even better for dates, I want a QDate edit whenever the cell needs to be edited. And then they said, okay, for that column here, I will have a special editor. So that's why they had this set item delegate for column. And then that delegate would be taking care of taking that string and converting it. In the meantime, I have at least personally been down the road of realizing I'm returning a Q variant. And we have the Q variant mechanism that we saw up here with the register converter, so that I could take any value that is known to the property system or the metatype system of Qt and convert that into a string. And the Qt, I'm not even sure whether it needed to do anything, the model view framework or the views to be accurate. But in any case, I can return a money instance and the view can display that without any delegate or anything. So why do I need to specify my delegates all over the place? There's an episode long ago by now where I talked about model view delegates and the delegate, or there was this method for creating custom editors. And I tried it and I was really excited, but it didn't work out in the end because I did not have information about the actual index anymore. And for that, I do have a delegating delegate to introduce you to now. See, you can set a delegate on a column, on a row. I was almost about to say on a cell, but you can't. But you can also set a delegate on the whole table or the whole tree. And in my code, at least, I have a KDAB table view class that I use throughout. And that's what I simulate here. Simply imagine, or if you don't have that, you can also still use this, but then go to find your view and set item delegate on it. And this delegate down here, it implements a Q abstract item delegate. That's a superclass. And it's implement all the virtual method of that superclass. And the only thing it does in each and every one of those is that it delegates to another delegate. And the other delegate is the one that takes care of the real work. And the trick here is to say, okay, delegate for index. So given an index, what delegate should I be using? I say, okay, if the index is not valid, then I'll just return a default Q item delegate. Fair enough. Get the display role, or should that be display or edit role? You could argue over that. But get the display role in this example here and ask for the type ID. And now if the type ID is the Q metatype date, that's the Q register metatype for Q date, the number that one returned, then create an instance of date delegate. If it's a money instance, then return an instance of the money delegate. And let me just go back to main and validate. We are step 2. And now you'll notice that by just setting this delegate on my whole view, I still edit money instances with the money delegate. You can see even here that the dates are formatted with the date delegate, and I edit them with a date editor. And finally, this here is just a string that I edit with a regular Q item delegate. And this is approximately where I was yesterday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I was thrilled about this solution because I have lots and lots of tables and quite some trees in my application. And I was submitting one patch after the other for review for this stuff here. And then at some point, I realized, did you hear that? And do it again. See? What? Nothing happens. Usually my delegate should stop editing whenever the return key is pressed. That's one of the things that are built in. And it didn't work anymore. And I was puzzled. So I started thinking, and I would like to give you a condensed version of my yesterday from 9 o'clock in the evening till 1 o'clock in the morning, where I was trying to figure out what was going on. And I'll do this using the codebrowser.dev that I talked about in the previous episode, because it's a super tool actually for navigating around the Qt source code and trying to figure out what was going on. Are you ready? Here we go. Okay. Before I show you any code, let's do a bit of thinking together, because an important thing about all of this is to know where to start. So when I press enter on any of the delegate, they should stop editing. How's that even possible? You are very rusty on the event system. Here is yet another link from Programming with Qt Widgets where I talk about the event system. And another one. This time I talk about event filters, because what you have to realize is that the event will not make it to the table view that is sitting up there at the top, and which is the one that needs to tell the delegate to stop editing, or to the delegate which isn't even anything that has it's a queue object, so it doesn't have any event handling for key press events. The event will only make it to the editor that was created using create editor. So I create an editor using create editor, and then it is sitting on top of my table. The only way that I can be notified about something as vital as enter being pressed, and all editors, Qt Widget doesn't by default have an enter. So the only way I can be notified about that is if I have an event filter installed on that widget. Okay. I will press the Control F1 now, which gets me to the codebrowser.dev. And if you are like, wow, get another link, this time to the previous episode in Qt Widgets and more, where I showed you how to set that up. Qt table view source code here. So here's my Qt table view. And actually, if I think about it, it's the same thing both for the table and for the trees. So let's go up into the Qt tree view right away. And this is a time where I will go and jump over to the CPP file here. You can see that I'm in the CPP file, if nothing else, from the URL qabstractitemu.cpp. Somewhere there gotta be an installed event filter. There is an installed event filter right here. That's not the one I was searching for. I'm sure I did yesterday, but here there is one. Set index widget. That is not the one I was searching for either. Come on. There we are. This is the one. And why do I know this is the one? Besides, it's getting the editor. So this is likely, see, it's in the private section. And if you have not yet watched this episode of Qt Widgets and more, then that's the episode where I'll talk with Pepe about which or how does the Qt source code work at all. And they have this private for those things that you shouldn't be using in your code, but of course you are very welcome to go and look at it, just like we do now. So in the private section here, we can see that I call on the delegate. So I get a Q abstract item delegate, and on that delegate, I call create editor. Yes, we saw that a bit early on. This one, create editor, gives me a Q widget back. Ooh, I'm listening now. And then if there was a widget back, I install an event filter. And usually it would say this down here at the end, but it say install event filter on delegate. So on the Q abstract item delegate that I got here, I now install an event filter, meaning that whenever some events come to the widget, so the the date editor or the money editor or whatever it was called, whenever an event comes to that, including key press events, then I will call event filter method of my delegate. So let's go up and look at Q abstract item delegate and see if we can find that event filter. And now it became red, indicating there is no such thing in this class here called event filter. Trust me, yesterday evening, I started getting gray hair because, let me just go back. The install event filter on the delegate, but the delegate doesn't have any event filter. What is up with that? Well, the event filter comes from Q object, right? So if there's nothing, then it just doesn't do anything. But it got to be something to do with event filters. But then it struck me, well, maybe, just maybe, the event filter is actually implemented in one of the subclasses of Q abstracts item delegate, namely in Q item delegate. Let's have a look at that. I'll go up here. I will search for Q item delegate.cpp. That's the one here. Search for event filter, and it's find something. There's documentation here, and here is the event filter. Hooray! There was an event filter. It just calls onto editor event filter, which is in the private part. So if you haven't watched that episode yet, bing, there's an episode on how to read the Qt source code and how they split using the D pointer into private and public API. So here is the D pointer part of it. And if I just read through here, there's something about key tab, key backspace. Oh, there it is. Key enter and key return. So if it hears on the widget, this is the delegate. So it's the delegate on the widget. Here's this key return. Then it will call invoke method. That is the way of you calling another method using Qt connection. So we'll send it through the event queue, and it will call Q underscore that thing here. Let's see if we can find that. Oh, it even found that. Oh, that's pretty cool. And it found it here. And among other things, it calls emit commit data, emit close editor, which is exactly the way that enter works. Okay, now I know. Back then I knew why it didn't work, but how to solve that problem. Going back here, this was a rather long function. I definitely did not want to replicate that. And there might be other stuff in here that would be useful to have. So let me get one step further back. That was the call here, the event filter that wasn't implemented on my Q abstract item delegate. Could I just subclass in my delegating delegate? Wow. Could I just override that event filter method and do the exact same thing? That seems pretty easy, except that in my subclass, I do not have access to the D pointer, and therefore I can't call that internal API. This is no land for me to go to. Scratching my head quite a bit, I looked at the implementation of Q item delegate and came to the conclusion, how about I go back over here and I find my delegating delegate, and instead of subclassing from Q abstract item delegate, how about just subclassing from Q item delegate? Then I'll get to that thing. I override all of the API anyway, and I just need to go like this, and time to compile. Now it will hopefully compile pretty fast. It did. And running it over here again. Aha! Well, that was my tab key, sorry. Aha! You don't trust me, do you? You obviously do seem to have trust issues. Here, enter key, and it works just fine. There's one feature missing now, and I'll leave that up to you to implement. I'll give you some hints on how you can do that. Namely, what if I want some of my delegates for dates to show in ISO and some of them to show in local, or some other thing where I need to customize the delegate? Well, first of all, that's a solution in my code base. You can just, for those columns, still create an instance of that delegate. If you have a delegate that you can customize that way, then you can always say set item delegate for column, and that will take precedence over the item delegate you set on the table or the tree. But if you really want the golden plate solution to this, what I would do is that I would create a role for the model or for the delegate to ask the model. So the role could be called date format, and the delegate would then, about to paint it, it would call index.data, and then with this date format role, and get the format back. That way, for every single index, I could customize how they should look. Was that new stuff for you? Here is the final link. I swear this time, this link is about how delegates or views can talk to the model via custom roles. I hope you enjoyed this tour over model view programming. As I said, the Programming with Qt widget has a whole module on that, so there's much more to be learned over there. And then lots and lots of episodes in Qt widgets and more talk about that. I thought it would be interesting and useful to go through these things. When I prepared this example here, I was cutting away stuff like check_data. But I thought, hey, why not make the code look more like the code that I have in my real production code, so that you can get a best practices of everything. I hope you enjoyed that. And until next time, I wish you a great life, a great career, a great everything. And do like and subscribe to this one while you are having such a great time. I'm Mr. Peterson from KDAB.